Hey guys, so today's chapter is interesting because it is an interview with Sarah, whom I call Elizabeth, and it's a little bit kind of all over the place. You can tell that she is in her older age of life, in her late 90s, and she's trying to recall these events in her life, and she's kind of just bouncing back and forth. And so there are some parts where she's a little repetitive, but this is the exact interview. So it's almost like we're there in the room with her while she's being interviewed. So kind of fun. It's in these interviews where she gives us a bit more detail about her life and some of the customs of the time. And it's also in these chapters where we get to take more of a dive into the history of that time period. We get to read about some church history from her perspective. She tells us about some old books that are old now, but weren't as old back then, and tells us why these are her favorite books, these being rare church history books, most which are no longer in print. She shares some passages from them. And I love it when she talks about the prophet Joseph Smith and her experience with the Nauvoo temple. So, having said all that, let's get right into today's chapter. Chapter 19. Sarah and T. Whitaker, as she called him, lived in the little Duell cabin for over a year and a half. Her first child was born there. Never would she forget the joy that glowed in the eyes and whole countenance of her husband when she told him she was going to have a baby. He really treated me like a queen, so far as was possible in our poor circumstances. He would caution me constantly about not lifting anything too heavy and to be careful not to trip and fall. Oh, he wanted a child all right, and tried in every way to please me and get me little presents, hoping to know that I was as pleased as he was. I wasn't at first, but I soon got over it. While he worked over on the property he had bought, starting a house for us of our own, I got out little Will's baby things, sorted through them to see what else I'd need, and began knitting and sewing with whatever material I could get. One day, he took me over to see the adobe one-room house he had begun. It was way up in the lot, not near the road at all. "I don't want to live way up here off the road," I exclaimed. "I want to live down close to the road where I can see what goes on, and if a wagon passes through, I want to see it." "No," he said firmly. "My dear, that would be far too dangerous for the children. They might run out in the road and get run over by one of those big wagons and be killed." A heated argument followed, but he would not budge from his stand. I learned that when he wanted to be firm, he was immovable. But I was bitterly disappointed at the location of the house and did not change either. More about the house later. Sarah goes on to tell in her own words, "My child Sam was born December 20th, 1859, on the Duell place. Mrs. Duncan was the midwife. I had often heard of her and some of her family. The Duncans crossed the plains in our company, and everyone who had her seemed to love her. She was better than some professed doctors, a splendid midwife and nurse. Her fee for delivery was $5 and $1 a day for the time she stayed with the patient. She just loved children and had a family of her own, and did all the housework, everything while nursing her patients. Many women had her, and then were too poor to pay her, but she went wherever she was called, pay or no pay." Then Sarah added, "That fall, about 2 or 3 months before Sam was born, Maggie Brandon, a neighbor, invited me to go berry picking with her. They were called service berries that grew wild on the hillside, mostly in the sloping part of the canyon. I went, and we were gathering berries and getting along with the work just fine, when all at once my foot slipped, and I went rolling down the sandy bank clear to the side of the stream below. As I rolled, I clutched at the shrubs and tried to catch myself, but could not. I was terribly shaken up, and they took me home. I didn't lose the baby, but was sick in bed for 3 weeks. T. Whitaker was terribly angry with Maggie Brandon for taking me, but I had a good rest while lying in bed anyway. It was when they took me home that Sister Duncan was called, and they thought sure the baby would come early. It was she who ordered the 3 weeks of bed rest. I liked her the minute she came in my door, and my love and respect grew for her as time went on. She was such a good woman, and so kind, and she loved the children. There's nothing very bad in a body who truly loves little children. I couldn't stand to be idle. I wanted to do something. So I learned to weave straw hats from fine oat straw while in bed. We had to soak the straw first, then select the very best ones for the crown and center. The small end of one straw was pushed up into the lower end of the other straw to connect them, and this was done all the way along so that on the right side you could not tell where one straw ended and another began. I liked doing it, and years later made hats for T. Whitaker, and also for Will and Sam when they were young men. They liked them to wear in summertime. They were so cool and more comfortable. Soon, as I was up and around again, I decided to go to Salt Lake and visit my mother. I took Will with me, and I walked those 12 miles. I found she had a gentleman caller. She introduced to me George Rowley. He was courting her. I could see he was much younger than she, and I wanted him to know she was a grandmother. So I took my boy and set him in her lap and said, "There, go to your grandmother." She was furious. She did not show her age and was a very proud woman. She exclaimed, "I'm grandmother to no one." I didn't care for him from the first, but that made no difference. She married him anyway. He was at least 5 years younger than my mother. He was an Englishman, rather short, arms covered with thick red hair, medium complexion, a little darker than mother, brownish-gray eyes. He, too, played the violin, but not like T.W. That's one thing that attracted him to my mother. But he had nothing, and my mother had everything. To set up housekeeping, I mean. He had hired himself out as a team master to get to Salt Lake. He was a Mormon convert. He helped bring Johnston's army into the valley. They lived a while in Salt Lake, and then he took her to Ogden and later to Huntsville. Then, much later, they went to Bear Lake, and he got rich and bought a farm. He bought the first threshing machine in Utah and made money, going out and threshing other people's grain besides his own. My mother was a very proud woman, and beautiful, with exquisite skin and complexion. She never told her real age, and was always just 40. Mother had 2 boys by Rowley, George and Daniel. We called the latter Danny. I loved that child. George was all right too, till he grew up. And then he got into bad company and went downhill. They both grew up and had families. Danny stayed true to the church and came to see me whenever he could in later years. Rowley wanted to breed horses. He sent to Scotland for a blooded stallion. He paid $300 for it, which was more than most Mormons had in a lifetime. It got mad and killed 3 different men, trampled them to death. It would suddenly rear up on its hind legs when being led to water and attack the man leading it. It almost killed Rowley on 2 occasions. Once when he was giving it a drink from a bucket, it nearly got him by biting his hat off his head completely. It tore his scalp badly, so he got rid of it. He couldn't get along with his sons when they grew up. Later he went away by himself and left my mother after having asked the bishop to take his name off the church records. He lost every cent he had, getting into bad company, and went from bad to worse. Finally, he lived in a little log cabin, and one day was found dead there. The 2 boys both had sandy hair, but were not the same build. Danny, the younger, was a big man and so kind and unselfish. He resembled my son John. He had 3 wives. His first wife had 12 children by him, and she died. And then he married a second wife. She had no children. She died. He married a 3rd time. He brought her, the 3rd wife, to see me in 1932, late winter time. I was down in Salt Lake visiting my daughter, Josephine Folsom. I liked her. The last wife, she seemed like a lovely woman. I also liked his first wife. She came from a very fine family. Horsley was the name, I think. George lived with Mother for a long time, but he was lazy. She had to work too hard, and she waited on him hand and foot. He finally married and had 4 girls and 1 boy. He lost one girl named Elizabeth for me when they lived in Provo, and then they moved to Ogden. He died in Ogden, and he and the little girl are buried there. He, too, left the church. He worked for the railroad. I must tell you a little about my mother. She used eggs in many different ways. She'd open a hot baked potato, salt it, and break an egg into it. She had a special way of making tea. She had a little china casket set in a woven mesh basket-like cover. It had a partition in the center. She kept green tea in one compartment and black in the other. And while she made her tea, she put a teaspoonful of green and one of black into the heated pot and poured fresh boiling water over it and let it steep 4 minutes. When she poured it out, she'd put a spoonful of gin in each cup if she could get it. "It's far better than cream," she'd say. If she had no gin, she'd put 2 or 3 whole cloves in the pot and pour the tea over them. That tasted good, too, but sugar was very scarce for years. I remember hearing once that it sold for $100 for a 100-pound sack. I didn't ever try her potato and egg dish either. I only liked eggs when they stood still on my plate. I couldn't stand to see them run or wiggle. Mother often used eggs in her coffee when there was no cream. She'd beat up the first egg and pour it into her cup, and then the hot coffee over the beaten egg. But I couldn't go for that either. I'd rather do a washing than patch. When I lived in Salt Lake near Mother, I'd do her whole washing and ironing if she'd patch one pair of overalls for me or a dress. My mother just loved fish. She was a true Manxman. She could live on fish, but she liked herring best of all. In Douglas, Isle of Man, they ate fish all the time. When she was a bit sick and wanted something tasty, she'd beg me to get her a nice salty herring. They're little red fish, you know, between 6 and 8 inches long, and salty as bloaters. She lived to be 94. She died in Soda Springs up near Bear Lake and is buried there. Sarah sat deep in thought for a moment or two and then continued. Perhaps while on the subject of Mother, I should tell you that she was born in Chatham, Kent, England, November 10th, 1816. I don't know just when they went to Douglas, Isle of Man, but she always referred to herself as a true Manxman. They practically lived on fish, and it was always her favorite food. I know lots more about my father's people than I do about hers. When she joined the Mormon church, and we went to bid her mother and family goodbye, and they learned she was a Mormon, they slammed the door in our faces and would not let us into the house. "We want none of you, nor your darn Mormon brats," she cried. I can barely remember that grandmother, as I only got a glimpse of her before we were thrown out. We have never been able to trace her, but my mother tells me the story, as she knew it before she married my father. Her name was Mary. She married William Hall. My father was son of Thomas Mills, and his mother, Alice MacDonald. He was born in Belfast, Antrim, Ireland. So was she. They went to Isle of Man after her parents were married. William Hall, my mother's father, fought in the Battle of Waterloo, June 18th, under Duke of Wellington, British General of Irish troops. Wellington later became Prime Minister of England. William Hall married Mary, a French canteen girl, whom he met that day on the battlefield. She became my mother's mother. We have never been able to trace her people, nor even her maiden surname. There were no nurses, but these girls braved the battlefield to go out and give water from a canteen each carried to the wounded and dying soldiers, whether French or British, to help relieve their suffering. I was named Elizabeth for my mother, but I hated the nickname of Lizzie, so I called myself Sarah sometimes. On this dreadful Battle of Waterloo, which lasted only 1 day, Mary, the French canteen girl, soon drained the last of the water from her canteen. Then, nothing the anguished suffering of the thirsty sufferers on the battlefield, she, acting as an angel of mercy, held her cupped hands under the gushing wounds of the dying soldiers, and caught the blood, and poured it into the parched mouths of other wounded soldiers who were dying of thirst after the terrible battle. Again, she seemed deep in thought before continuing. I don't know about their courtship, but it must have been a short one. He took her back to Chatham, and they lived there until my mother was born. I don't know whether or not they had other children. I don't know whether or not they had other children, but have always believed that they did. I don't even know when my parents went to the Isle of Man, as father was born in Ireland. So was his mother, Alice MacDonald, but his parents and their family all went to Douglas, capital of Isle of Man. That's where I was born, March 7th, 1839. I was their second child. My oldest sister, Mary Jane, born March 19th, 1837 in Douglas, died when she was about 2.5 years old. She's buried there. They named me for my mother. Thomas was their third child, born November 6, 1841, also in Douglas. And then after we joined the church and came to America, William was born in Nauvoo, their fourth child, June 5, 1844. Sarah seemed lost in thought, but finally went on. It's hard to get old. I used to look at old people and feel sorry for them. But I always loved to talk to them, and I learned much from listening to what they could tell me. Now I am old, too. When I feel cross and especially irritable with anyone or anything, I go and take a nice warm bath and doll all up and smile to myself in the mirror. Pretty soon, I feel like a new person, and the whole world seems all right once more. Well, I could go on, but we'll talk about my past more another time. But first, I must tell you about the rest of Mother's children. Alice was born after we were driven from Nauvoo at Fort Madison, Iowa, in 1846. The exact day and month of her birth have been lost. Many lost their records. Everything. They had to move so much, and it was so hard to keep track of everything. But Alice grew up and got married to a Mr. Smith, and I have completely lost track of her many, many years ago. My mother's sixth child was named Martha, and she was born January 8th, 1850, at Drakesville, Davis, Iowa. She never married. That I know of. I think she died young in her late teens. I'm not too sure. Then, another day when Sarah felt rather spry and talkative, she began. Well, if you're going to write a book about me, I suppose I should go back to when I was just a little girl in Nauvoo, and they were building the Nauvoo temple. I used to take my father's lunch to him every day, and there I would see the prophet Joseph. My mother was an excellent cook, and she'd sometimes put in an extra piece of chocolate cake or other dessert, and father would share it with the prophet. Sometimes that wonderful man would take me on his knee, there on the steps of the temple, and stroke my hair and tell me how beautiful it was, and that I must always strive to be as beautiful inside, meaning my spirit, as I was on the outside. For, said he, Jesus loves little children, and he wants them to grow up pure and clean, so they can come back to heaven and dwell with him forever. Did I tell you that my father was a professional tinsmith, and that he made and mounted the hooves and horns and bars of the oxen in the basement of the temple that held up the baptismal fonts? I wasn't old enough then, when the temple was finished, to be baptized in it, but I remember that glorious building and how hard everyone worked and skimped and saved to get it finished. It never was completely finished. My parents were permitted to go through it for their own endowments and sealing. On the 13th of December, 1845. It was opened only one day for living sealings, when the city was mobbed and that glorious temple was destroyed by them. It was burned to the ground, and as foretold in prophecy, not one stone was left on top of another. Of course, this was after the martyrdom. When we were still in Nauvoo, someone from the Isle of Man sent me an exquisitely beautiful doll, made of wax, and encased in a glass globe, with a removable bottom to it. It was dressed in yellow satin, with white bobinette over it. I never cared much for dolls, but I loved that one, though I didn't play with it much. Usually I left it in the glass globe case, but one day I gave it to my little sister to play with, and someone grabbed it from her and bit a great bite out of its chin. It was wax, you know. And oh, how bad I felt. I cried over that, but what good did that do? It couldn't fix my doll. Then I remember when we were driven from Nauvoo. It was in the winter time, but they wouldn't let us wait till spring. So we crossed that terrible river on rafts, most of us, with great chunks of ice hitting and almost upsetting our rafts at times. The men pushed ice chunks back with logs, and they bumped into our rafts and boats. Then the men built bouweries on the other side of the river, and we huddled under them together, close, to try to keep warm and dry. Some had tents, but most had nothing but the bouweries. I remember a woman taught me to knit, though I wasn't quite 8 years, and I knitted myself a pair of stockings while there. Brigham taught the people to keep even the little children busy, and I learned to work from the time I can remember anything. Even in the Isle of Man, my mother had sick headaches, and I had to stand on a chair and wash the dishes. I learned to set the table and make bread, do some cooking, standing on a chair to mix the bread. I've always loved to work, never cared to play much. Rather do almost any kind of work, no matter how hard, than nothing at all. We were taught to read, too, and I read the Book of Mormon through several times when I was 8 years old, many times since then. That and the Bible were the only books I could find among us then. I still like to work with my hands. Brigham taught that to be idle was a sin. Idleness is the devil's workshop, he'd say. While we were there, the river flooded its banks and left many sinkholes and mudholes where vipers and insects bred. I saw one little boy playing near one of these mudholes, and a copperhead snake bit him. He died less than 3 hours later. And oh, that terrible night before we left Nauvoo, when the prophet and his brother Hiram were murdered. Never shall I forget that. The people were up in arms, and the Mormon band played martial music and marched up and down the streets to try to quiet them. To this day, I can't listen to martial music without all that coming back to me, and I want to cry. But even when we had no bread, later here in the valley, I don't believe I suffered great hunger. That terrible kind when there is nothing, she pronounced it, nothing, to eat. Neither have I ever overeaten or wasted my food. But when the Indians stole me, I made up my mind I'd starve myself to death rather than live with them. And I'd have done it, too. I've often said that if I could just have a nice cup of tea and some good bread and butter, I'd never complain. I've had good many ups and downs in my life, more downs than ups, I sometimes think. Of course, you know, we were a long time moving from place to place, even before we got to Council Bluffs, Iowa. We had to stop wherever my father could find work, sometimes for months at a time. We lost practically everything when we were driven from Nauvoo. We needed money for equipment to cross the plains, wagon, oxen, and provisions. We stayed longest at Winter Quarters, Iowa, I think. It was there that my little brother William died of diphtheria. There are many, many graves there. All died from that terrible disease, and all were Mormons. I was big enough to help some to nurse the sickest ones. I didn't get the disease, and even later, when 2 of my own children died with it, right here in Centerville, I didn't get it. I heard rumors that they may someday make a monument to all who died there and to honor those who lost their loved ones at that time. At last, we were ready and equipped to cross the plains. Captain Wilkie led our company. He had crossed them twice before. Each company consisted of some 100 souls. She may have meant families or wagons. Each company was subdivided into multiples of 10. And when we got to about that place where Denver is now, we learned that the Indians were on the warpath. In one place, we found the body of a white man who had been killed by them. His limbs had been cut off and crossed on his body. Captain Wilkie said that this was the sign that the Indians were angry, and this was one form of revenge. Later, we came upon a scene where a whole non-Mormon company had been killed, and everything they had was burned. All that was left was the scrap iron of the wagons and the iron bands that encircled the wheels. Such sights filled our hearts with dismay and horror. Captain Wilkie ordered all men to stay at the head of their oxen and not unyoke them. And when it became necessary for us to camp, each wagon was chained to the wagon wheel in front of it and formed a large circle of wagons. Inside this circle, we made camp. We traveled all night sometimes to evade the Indians. Here follows her kidnapping story, which appears earlier. I went to school in Fort Madison, where we lived for some time, and then other schools as we moved on toward our ultimate goal, Salt Lake City. It was early in spring of 1852 that we started our journey under Captain Wilkie. I was 13 years old by then, but fully grown, and belied my age, often being taken for 16. We were many weeks on the plains, but when we got into the valley, Father rented a little 2-roomed cabin. They called them cottages then. The city was laid out most perfectly, with the temple block being the central or focal point. Then the blocks ran straight, east and west, north and south of it. The street directly east was called Main Street, the one east of that first east or State Street, and so on. The one north was North Temple, and on as far as the blocks were laid out. The one south, South Temple, and the one west was West Temple. Sometime later, she suddenly remembered something else. I don't think I ever told you about making molasses for the Sims. It was shortly after I got there, and I'd worked 14 hours and was dead tired. But they had gathered in what sugar beets they had raised, and they needed doing, so I said I'd do it. It might be a chance for me to read in the newly discovered book, The Scottish Chiefs by Jane Porter. I'd found this just the day before. I had to cut up the beets, boil them over the outside fire, stirring all the time so they wouldn't burn. Then I mashed them and drained and strained the juice and pressed it all through a sieve as best I could. The family went to bed soon as it was dark, but Jonathan did fix a nice supply of wood for me first. They had a great iron kettle on a crank over the fire. I got it all done, but the last boiling process. But by then, I was so tired I couldn't even read, and as I sat there stirring, I fell asleep. And when I woke up, the fire was out, but the molasses had turned to candy. I didn't tell my high-tempered mistress, but put the whole thing into a big barrel with the first batch already done. Well, it dissolved, and several days later, when my mistress tasted the molasses, she said it was the best-tasting molasses they had ever had. The children helped gather cottonwood and other sticks from the banks of the river. We had to have very hard wood for making lye. It left white ashes, very fine, and we'd pour boiling water over them after first stretching a very fine sieve over the big crock and place the ashes from the hard wood into the sieve. We'd let it stand and settle overnight and then pour more ashes on top and repeat the process. If possible, we'd use a huge vat and put the strainer near the bottom, filling the whole vat with hard wood ashes and pouring boiling water over it all. We also made dye from indigo plants for blue, saffron for a sort of pink. We boiled walnut hulls to make a perfect brownish green, very dark dye. We had to buy our red dye from the friendly Indians. They would sell the dye, but not the secret formula for making it. Really, making the dye was easier than the lye, for if we did the lye right, we had to get that big crock or vat full of ashes. First, we'd add to it from time to time. Sometimes it took a whole year. The moisture from the clean boiling water would gradually seep through the ashes, and it was a clear liquid that was very powerful and looked like brandy. We would pour this liquid into a glass jar and seal it for future use. When ashes were plentiful, we could make enough for several families for a year in this way, and then each family could make their own soap and candles from the rendered fat, and dripping from cooking. Not a drop was wasted. Brigham taught us that willful waste brings woeful want. He did the same with his own family. Eat it up, wear it out, make it do, was a motto he expected us all to follow. When there was a family that had nothing and needed food or clothing, he'd see that the father, if he was well, would work on the church lot, or help in the tithing office to earn the food. Everyone was expected to work. Brigham Young was a fine man and a good leader. It was in the summer of 1854 that the valley was again visited by a terrible scourge, not of crickets this time, but green grasshoppers, winged, that flew through the air in great hordes. The crops were thriving beautifully and promised a bounteous harvest, but these dreadful insects, long as your finger appeared in a thick cloud that partially darkened the sun. They devoured every speck of the field whereon they'd light. Then on to the next field. The folks trembled at the destruction they were witnessing and resorted to the only way they knew could help them. They bowed as an entire body in earnest prayer and supplication. Once more, as if by a miracle, when the hordes of grasshoppers rose in the air in a mighty cloud to attack the next field, a strong east wind swept down the entire valley from the mountains of the east. It blew them high in the air, then westward over the lake, the Great Salt Lake, and deposited them into its salty waters where they were drowned. Myriads of them were washed upon the shore as the wind changed suddenly from east to west. The people regarded this as a true miracle, and many exclaimed it was proof that the Lord takes care of his own, even as the children of Israel who were fed by quail and manna while in the desert for 40 years. They never had a change of clothing. God blessed what they wore, and it lasted 40 years. But that following winter there was a great scarcity of bread and flour. Many had only cornmeal and very little of that. I was in Salt Lake then before I was married. I remember Brigham telling in meeting of his little son who, like all the rest of the saints, was put on strict rations so that no one would actually starve. Brigham put his own family, children included, on rations too, and he said that his little son came to him and said, "Father, that poor woman living down the street is starving, and she has a little baby who is crying for food. They have no bread, nothing. Can't I give her my share today if I go without?" And Brigham said, "Yes, my son, if you wish to do that, you may. But if you give her yours, you must go without." And he did. His father thought that showed fine character and was proud of his boy. There was much sickness among the people that winter, including Brigham and his family. Some thought this strange, that he should be ill, being their leader and appointed by God, as it were. But he responded, "All our sufferings in this life are for our good, that we may learn the contrast between good and evil. Jesus descended below all things, that he might rise above all things. All men who receive the same glory must abide the same law. Some are alarmed because so many of my family are sick. I have as good a right to be sick as anybody. I do not wish to escape affliction, sickness, pain, or sorrow, any more than others escape them. For if we make a right use of them, they will return to us in blessings. I made up my mind years ago to be governed by principles. I resolved that I would never be controlled by my passions, by women, nor by anger, but that I would govern myself. This resolution I have endeavored to carry out in my life, and this exact quote, it says, is in Wilford Woodruff's history of his life and labors as recorded in his daily journals, prepared by Matthias F. Cowley, 1909 edition, chapter 37, page 397. She went on to say, "I have that book, you know, and also The Life and Travels of Parley P. Pratt, edited and published by his son in 1874. T. Whitaker bought me that one when it first came out. You could get it only by personal subscription then. It is dark red, leather bound, and I treasure it very much. There was only the one printing of it, you know. Then there is that whole wonderful set of History of the Church, 7 volumes, written and compiled by B.H. Roberts, he being one of our own Centerville residents. Yet he is known the world over for his fine mind and ability to speak and to lecture as well as to write. But I don't suppose I'll ever get to read all 7 books. I know I lived through a great deal of what's in them, and what I have read makes me know that the whole works are not just good, but true and wonderfully put together. We have some very intelligent men and women. Too, in our church. I've always been proud to be a member and to sustain those placed in authority." Here she stopped abruptly, looked up at me and said, "Do you still have that book I brought with me when I came to stay here with you? It's called Women of Mormondom, and T. Whitaker gave it to me when it first came out." "Oh, yes, that's it," she exclaimed, as I reached it from the bookshelf. "It's by Edward W. Tullidge, printed in 1877 in New York. There was just one printing. It was a sort of peace offering to me from my husband for the way he had hurt me, but I put it up on the top shelf of my bookcase and would not read it until 10 years later. But once I had read it, it helped me ever so much. I will explain how later, when we come to that part in my life. But for now, I want to tell you about the turmoil following the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram. I was just a little girl, but well do I remember, as if it were yesterday, that 27th day of June, 1844, in the evening when word came to all of us, the saints in Nauvoo, from Carthage Jail, Clay County, Illinois, that our beloved leader and prophet and his brother Hiram had been murdered, shot down, and their bodies pierced a number of times with bullets, even after they were dead. Then the mob fled, leaving the dead men behind on the ground outside the jail, and Brother John Taylor, whom they presumed was dead also, lying critically wounded in the upstairs room of the jail. He was rescued by Dr. Willard Richards, and it was his eyewitness account of the great tragedy that is given in the history of the church. I referred to this event earlier, but then I slipped over it, without giving it the prominence in my life story that it deserves. For though I was only a very little girl, I remember all. I must try to let you who read this, perhaps long after I'm gone, that you might experience something of what I felt, and what every Mormon member felt on that terrible night. There were many bookmarks in the well-worn book, and she searched them carefully, holding the book close up to her fading eyesight. "Oh, here it is. This tells it lots better than I can. If you will read the second paragraph on page 297, chapter 30. Your eyes are younger than mine. Read it to me, please." She handed me the book, and I read as written by Eliza R. Snow, the prophet's second wife. This awful tragedy of the 27th of June, 1844, is a livid, burning, scathing stain in our national escutcheon. To look upon the noble, lifeless forms of those two brothers, Joseph and Hiram Smith, as they lay side by side in their burial clothes, having been brought home from Carthage, where they had been slaughtered in their manhood and in their innocence, was a sight that might well appall the heart of a true American citizen. But what it was for loving wives and children, the heart may feel, but the tongue can never tell. This scene occurred in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, to which our ancestors fled for religious freedom, where the dear old flag yet waves, and under which not one effort has been made to bring to justice the perpetrators of that foul deed. I was about to hand the book back to her, but she said, "No, read me about the mantle of Joseph falling on Brigham Young. Go on to the next place I have marked, the part told by Zina D. Young." I did as she asked, and found on page 326, quote, "Never can it be told in words what the saints suffered in those days of trial. But the sweet Spirit did not forsake them, and when the 12 apostles returned weeks later, the mantle of Joseph fell upon Brigham. In the meeting, when I approached the stand, on the occasion when Sidney Rigdon was striving for the guardianship of the church, President of the 12, Brigham Young, was speaking. But it was the voice of Joseph Smith, not that of Brigham Young. His very person was changed. The mantle was truly given to another. There was no doubting this in the minds of that vast assembly. All witnessed the transfiguration, and even today thousands bear testimony of it. I closed my eyes. I could have exclaimed, "I know that is Joseph Smith's voice." Yet I knew he had gone, but the same Spirit was with all the people present. The Comforter remained. I glanced up at the face of my dear grandmother as I closed the book. There were tears trickling unnoticed down her thin, worn cheek. Her eyes were closed as she relived that great experience of her childhood. This was a great and marvelous testimony to me, though I never doubted ever since my blindness was healed back home in the Isle of Man. Hearing our beloved Joseph's voice when we all knew he was dead, and then looking up where Brigham stood on the stand and seeing not his form, but the form of Joseph, our prophet, it shook me and others to the very roots of our beings, and I knew no one but God could do such a miracle. Take Eliza R. Snow, for example. Did you know that she was sealed in polygamy to the prophet Joseph Smith? Well, she was. But more about her and polygamy later. Now it's time we go back to my life in Centerville. Don't you think so? We were still living in the little log cabin on the Duell property when I gave birth to Sam, my first child by T. Whitaker. Sister Duncan was my nurse, and she was also a real doctor and one of the best I have ever known. As I mentioned, when Mary had her first baby, they tied towels on each side of the head of the bed, or sides, so that the woman in labor could pull on them to help ease the pain. But Mrs. Duncan didn't do that, and it never did help me anyway. It was she who taught me to get on my knees on the floor. It was hard, but quicker and much better if the birth was to be a normal one, head presented first. She'd make a thorough examination first, and then help with the labor until the whole thing was over. And as I said, it was she who taught me to get on my knees, to hasten the delivery, and it worked best of all for me. Such things as ether or chloroform were unobtainable for any but the most critical cases, then only by male doctors, and Seymour B. Young was the only one I ever saw use it in those early days when my children were born. Later, when my grandchildren came along, we got doctors, sometimes, though I delivered many of my own grandchildren with no anesthetic at all, except for the hot sling or toddy, which I told you of. Us poor devils of Mormons had nothing very easy, especially in the early days. As for me, all I've known all my life was work. My mother had dreadful sick headaches and had to lie in bed. Couldn't hold up her head at times. So I'd stand on a chair and mix bread and do the dishes and everything that was to be done. Sister Duncan's fee for delivery of the child was $5, and then $1 per day as long as she stayed with her patient. She'd do all the housework, cooking, washing, and ironing, and run the household, so the patient had fine care and a great rest all the same time. I had her for all my children as long as she could come, but the last ones came afterward. Then I had a very dear soul we all call Grandma Brown. She was a poor widow, but a good midwife. She had a family to support and worked very hard. Could do just about anything. I just loved her, too. We'll talk more about her later on, I hope. T. Whitaker was away from home, helping his boss, Charles C. Rich, with some work in Salt Lake, the day Sam was born. We had been married about 18 months. It was a cold December day, the 20th, in 1859. I felt the first sharp pain in my back, only 10 minutes after my husband left. I was alone, but I went outside and watched for someone to call to, and hailed a man in a wagon going down the road past the cabin. I called to him and asked if he'd please go and get Sister Duncan. He went, and she was back to my house in less than an hour, and my son Samuel Thomas was born. And that's it for today's chapter. So we just finished page 230 in the book, and we have until page 327 until we're finished. So we have about 10 more chapters left. Some of them are short, some of them are long. But as you can see, we've reached a point where it's more just a copy of the interview that she had with her granddaughter. So as you're listening to this, you're probably wondering, hey, some of the things she's saying is a little bit different than what was in the story. And we're going to talk about that in the documentary. So as soon as we get to that point, as we finish these chapters, I have a whole documentary that I'm preparing that will cover all of this. It will talk about her story in its accuracy as far as we know. And it will also fill in some gaps, answer some questions. And I'm going to give you some updates on some of these people where their story left off and it just seemed to be a dead end. I revisit their stories and traced what happened to them, and I plan to share that with you in the documentary. Later on this month, in the month of January, I plan to prepare to order the headstone, and all of that will be documented in the documentary. Hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I will see you next week.